Rome, the Colosseum. The 17th day of September, 73 years after Christ. Beneath the arena floor in chambers that tourists will never see even 2,000 years later, a woman named Livia sits chained to a stone wall. She is 19 years old. 3 hours ago, she watched her two brothers die in the arena above. She heard the crowd roar as gladiators cut them down. She felt the vibrations through the stone as 50,000 Romans celebrated the destruction of her family. Her brothers were Dacian nobility captured during the recent campaigns along the Danube. They were educated men who spoke Greek and Latin, who had negotiated trade agreements and hosted diplomatic dinners. They died badly. One took 7 minutes to bleed out after a trident pierced his abdomen. The other survived long enough to beg for mercy that never came. The crowd loved every second. Livia is still wearing the silk dress she wore when Romans captured her family's compound 6 weeks ago. The silk is filthy now, stained with things she tries not to think about, but the guards have kept her in this dress deliberately. The contrast matters. Silk and chains, nobility and captivity, what she was and what she has become. She can hear footsteps approaching through the underground corridors, multiple sets, heavy boots on stone, men's voices discussing something in Latin that she only partially understands. The tone is casual. They are not discussing anything important, just routine business. Standard procedures for a normal day at the Colosseum. One of the guards stops outside her cell. The key turns in the lock. The door opens. 3 men enter. One wears the armor of an arena official. The other 2 are dressed in the leather and bronze of gladiators who have just fought. One of them has blood on his shoulder, fresh from whatever contest he just won. The official holds a wax tablet. He reads from it in the monotone of someone performing administrative tasks. Livia of Doccia, captive number 417, category 3 prisoner, assigned under the provision of Lex Vitorum to the gladiator Gas Valerius Maximus as reward for victory in the afternoon contests. He makes a mark on the tablet. The transaction is recorded. Everything in Rome is recorded. The bureaucracy of empire extends even to this underground chamber where a 19-year-old woman sits chained and terrified. The gladiator called Gas Valerius Maximus steps forward. He is perhaps 30 years old, scarred extensively with the build of someone who has survived the arena long enough to become valuable property. His eyes are empty of everything except exhaustion. The official departs. The door closes, the lock turns. Livia and the gladiator are alone in a cell designed for exactly this purpose. There are iron rings set into the walls at specific heights, a wooden bench positioned with calculated precision, drainage channels cut into the stone floor. This room has been used before. Many times the architecture makes that clear, but here is what makes this moment remarkable. What happened next is documented in sources that Rome tried very hard to suppress. Because what occurred in these chambers beneath the Colosseum was not random violence. It was systematic policy, a deliberately designed reward structure that transformed female prisoners into instruments of a brutal entertainment machine. And occasionally, when individuals like Gas Valerius Maximus made choices that deviated from expected behavior, the system's true nature became visible in ways that administrative records could not completely hide. Tonight you will discover what Rome built beneath the greatest amphitheater in the ancient world. The infrastructure designed to process captured women through stages of systematic humiliation. The legal frameworks that made exploitation official policy. The reward system that gave victorious gladiators ownership over female prisoners as payment for their service. The Senate debates that occurred when the practice became too visible to ignore. The individual stories of women whose names survived in sources that historians long dismissed as exaggeration. The archaeological evidence discovered only in the past 2 decades that confirms what the texts described. This is not sensationalized fantasy. This is documented Roman practice. The sources exist in multiple independent accounts. The physical evidence survives in spaces beneath the Colosseum that were sealed for centuries. The legal codes describe procedures in bureaucratic detail. The system was real. The women were real. What happened to them was worse than the deaths their brothers suffered in the sand above. Before we continue, understand that what follows examines systematic exploitation with historical accuracy. Rome constructed elaborate mechanisms for controlling and destroying captured populations. The genius of Roman administration extended to evil as efficiently as it extended to engineering. The horror lies not in chaos, but in order, not in breakdown of civilization, but in civilization functioning exactly as designed. Stay until the end. Because what you'll learn will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about Roman civilization. Like the video and subscribe to the channel to support a fellow history enthusiast, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'm always amazed by how far these stories reach. Now, let us return to that cell beneath the Colosseum and discover how Livy came to be chained there. But first, we must understand the arena itself and why Rome built such elaborate infrastructure for spectacle that combined entertainment with systematic cruelty. The Flavian Amphitheater, known today as the Colosseum, opened in 80 years after the Common Era. It took nearly a decade to build. It could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, depending on how tightly they packed the seating. It featured sophisticated engineering, including underground chambers, mechanical elevators for raising animals and prisoners to arena level, and hydraulic systems for creating elaborate water displays. The structure represented the pinnacle of Roman architectural achievement. Multiple levels of arcades, precisely calculated sight lines, ensuring every spectator could view the arena floor. Ventilation systems that managed airflow for tens of thousands of bodies packed together under Mediterranean sun. Awning mechanisms that provided shade. The engineering was brilliant, but the Colosseum was not primarily an engineering project. It was a political tool designed to serve specific functions within Roman imperial power structure. The arena provided free entertainment that kept urban populations satisfied despite overcrowding, poverty, and limited economic opportunity for common citizens. Bread and circuses was official policy. Keep them fed, keep them entertained, keep them from questioning the fundamental injustices built into Roman society. The games served this function explicitly. More importantly, the arena demonstrated Roman power through systematic violence. Every execution, every gladiatorial combat, every animal hunt reinforced the message that Rome was invincible, that resistance was futile, that enemies of the state would be destroyed publicly and theatrically. The spectacle was the point. Contemporary accounts described the atmosphere. Pliny the Younger wrote about attending games where the smell of blood mixed with the scent of saffron sprinkled on the sand to mask the odor of death. Seneca described the roar of crowds as overwhelming, like thunder that shook the stone. Martial catalogued the variety of deaths displayed from criminals burned alive while dressed as mythological figures to elaborate reenactments of famous battles where prisoners played the roles of defeated enemies who would actually die during the performance. The arena was theater where the script called for real deaths, entertainment where the tragedy was literal, art where the medium was human suffering. Into this system came prisoners of war. Rome's continuous military expansion generated steady supply of captives from conquered territories, Germanic tribes, Diane, Britain, North Africans. Anyone who resisted Roman authority and survived their defeat could be transported to Rome and displayed in the arena as living proof of Roman superiority. Male prisoners typically faced three possible fates: death in the arena through execution or forced combat, sale into slavery for labor in mines, farms, or construction projects, or occasionally, if they possessed valuable skills, incorporation into Roman households as educated slaves. Female prisoners faced different calculations. Their value derived from different functions. Labor was one consideration. Domestic service was another. But there was a third category that official sources describe with careful euphemisms and that modern historians have only recently begun examining honestly. The category was political humiliation rendered sexual, the systematic use of captured women to demonstrate not just military victory, but the complete destruction of enemy societies. What Roman sources called the demonstration of conquest through the ultimate subjugation of enemy populations. This was policy. It appeared in Senate debates. It was codified in law. It was administered through official channels. It was not the random violence of individual soldiers during battle, but the systematic exploitation of captive populations through institutional mechanisms that the empire constructed and maintained. The practice operated under various names in different periods. Victoria Carnal's Premium Sanguinis used Victoria. The terminology varied, but the essential practice remained consistent. Victorious gladiators received rewards for their service. One category of reward was access to female prisoners held in the underground chambers beneath the arena. This created a self-reinforcing system. Gladiators fought more viciously for greater rewards. Prisoners provided entertainment value through their presence. The crowd witnessed both the combat and its aftermath, knowing what awaited the women displayed in chains around the arena during victory celebrations. The entire mechanism served to demonstrate Roman power through every possible avenue. The Daean campaigns of the 70s provided the historical context for Libya's captivity. The Emperor of Vespasian was consolidating power after the chaos of the Year of Four Emperors. He needed military victories to legitimize his rule. The Daean territories along the Danube offered opportunities for conquest that would both secure borders and provide the captives needed for triumphant games in Rome. The campaigns were brutal. Roman legions burned villages. They destroyed agricultural infrastructure. They captured elite families specifically to display them in triumph. The goal was not just military victory, but the complete psychological defeat of populations that might otherwise organize future resistance. Livia's family was targeted deliberately. Her father had negotiated with Rome during earlier diplomatic contacts. He spoke Latin. He understood Roman politics. He represented the educated Daean elite that could potentially lead organized opposition. Capturing his family served strategic purposes beyond simple revenge. It demonstrated that even those who tried to work within Roman systems would be destroyed if Rome chose to expand into their territories. The capture itself was documented in official dispatches. A cohort commander named Marcus Antonius Primus Cent reports to Rome describing the seizure of noble families during the Daean campaign. His letters, preserved in collections of military correspondence, mention specific captives by name. Livia appears in one dispatch as daughter of the Daean nobleman Debiles, age approximately 18, suitable for display in triumph. She was property before she ever reached Rome. The dispatch did not describe her as a person, but as an asset with specific use value. The classification determined everything that followed. To understand what happened to Livia, you must first grasp the political calculations that Roman leadership made when deciding how to display and dispose of captured populations. The games were never merely entertainment. They were state propaganda operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Religious festival, political theater, demonstration of imperial power, tool for managing urban populations, revenue generator through associated gambling and commerce. Every aspect served deliberate purposes. The treatment of prisoners was particularly calculated. Rome did not simply execute enemies. Rome transformed enemy defeat into spectacle that reinforced specific political messages when criminals faced execution in the arena. They died in ways that demonstrated Roman law was absolute. The methods were theatrical: crucifixion, burning alive, being torn apart by animals. The cruelty was the point. It showed that challenging Roman authority led to destruction so complete that even death became prolonged horror. When gladiators fought, they demonstrated martial valor that Rome claimed to embody. The contests were framed as tests of courage and skill. Winners proved themselves worthy of life. Losers died badly, but supposedly with honor. The narrative was that Rome respected strength, even in enemies, rewarding gladiators who fought well with continued life and eventual freedom if they survived long enough. But captured women occupied a different category in Roman political thinking. They represented something beyond individual courage or criminality. They symbolized the conquered peoples themselves. Their treatment demonstrated what conquest meant at the deepest level. Not just military defeat, not just loss of political independence, but the violation of everything that defined a society's identity and honor. Roman sources are remarkably explicit about this when describing triumphs. Josephus, writing about the Jewish triumph after the fall of Jerusalem, describes how captured women were displayed in chains as representations of defeated Judea. Tacitus, describing various German campaigns, notes that displaying noble captive women demonstrated Roman power more effectively than showing dead warriors, because it proved Rome could take what enemy societies most valued and destroy it publicly. This was conscious strategy. Senate debates from the period reveal the thinking. A speech attributed to Senator Stronicus Capio during discussions about organizing games, discusses the political utility of humiliating female captives as way to prevent future rebellions. His argument, preserved in historical records, was that populations would be less likely to resist if they knew resistance meant not just death, but the systematic dishonor of their women displayed before Roman crowds. The logic was coldly pragmatic. Dead men became martyrs. Destroyed women became shame that conquered peoples wanted to forget. By making the cost of resistance include this particular form of humiliation, Rome calculated it could reduce future opposition more effectively than through simple military superiority. This thinking informed the reward system that gave victorious gladiators access to female prisoners. The practice served multiple functions. It rewarded valuable gladiators without requiring monetary payment. It demonstrated to crowds that Roman victory extended to every possible form of domination. It created profitable spectacle since crowds paid higher prices for games known to include such displays, and it destroyed enemy morale by ensuring that resistance led to consequences that transcended death. The Dacian rebellion of 70 to 73 provided a perfect opportunity to implement these policies on significant scale. DEA was wealthy. Its nobility was educated and sophisticated. It had maintained some independence despite Roman pressure. When Vespasian decided to crush Dacian resistance definitively, the capture of elite families like Livbia's was strategic priority. The triumph celebrating the Dacian victory included hundreds of captives. They were marched through Rome in chains while crowds celebrated. The display lasted 3 days. Prisoners were categorized and distributed to various faiths. Males mostly went to execution or slavery. Females were sorted by age, status, and physical condition. Livia was classified as Category 3. This designation appeared in administrative records maintained by arena officials. Category 1 was children and elderly distributed to slavery in households. Category 2 was common women sold in bulk to brothel or labor gangs. Category 3 was noble women of appropriate age, reserved for special purposes that official records described only as arena services. What arena services actually meant was documented in internal administrative papyri discovered in 19th-century excavations beneath the Colosseum. These documents, published in scholarly journals that most people never read, describe procedures with bureaucratic precision. Category 3 prisoners were held in specific underground chambers. They were provided minimal food and water to keep them healthy enough for display. They were brought to arena level during victory celebrations, and they were assigned to victorious gladiators according to formal protocols that administrators tracked with the same care they applied to equipment inventory. The system was not chaos. It was administered exploitation, operating at the heart of Roman civilization. Gaius Valerius Maximus was 32 years old when he entered Livia's cell that September evening. He had been a gladiator for 14 years, surviving far longer than the average of 3 to 5 years that most gladiators endured before death or crippling injury. His story began in Gaul. He was born free, the son of a blacksmith in a small village near Lugdunum. When he was 18, Romans accused his father of avoiding taxes. The penalty was enslavement of the entire family. His father was sent to mines where he died within months. His mother and sister were sold to a household in Rome. Gaius, young and strong, was evaluated as suitable for gladiatorial training and sold to Alutus, a gladiator school. He learned to kill efficiently. His trainers recognized his talent for reading opponents and adjusting tactics mid-combat. He specialized in fighting as a murmillo, heavily armored with a large shield and short sword. His style was defensive, patient, waiting for opponents to make mistakes rather than taking unnecessary risks. This approach kept him alive. Most gladiators died because they fought with desperation or excessive aggression, burning energy and flashy moves that left them vulnerable. Gaius fought to survive rather than to impress. He won enough matches to remain valuable. He earned enough money through victory bonuses to eventually purchase better equipment and living conditions. After a decade, he had accumulated the kind of value that made arena owners treat him as investment rather than expendable resource. But survival came at cost. 14 years of killing men in front of screaming crowds had destroyed something essential in his psychology. He functioned, he trained, he fought, but he felt nothing except exhaustion and a distant awareness that the person he had been at 18 no longer existed. The reward system had evolved during his career. In earlier years, victorious gladiators received monetary bonuses, but as the supply of prisoners increased with Vespasian's various campaigns, arena officials began offering access to female captives as alternative reward. Many gladiators preferred this. Money could be stolen or taxed. The pleasure of dominating a woman who had been enemy nobility was something that felt like genuine victory in a life otherwise defined by servitude. Gas had claimed this reward before, 3 times in the past 2 years. Each experience left him feeling worse than the previous. The first time he had convinced himself the woman was enemy who deserved whatever happened. The second time he recognized she was a terrified teenager who had done nothing except be born into family that resisted Rome. The third time he could not complete what he was expected to do and instead sat in the cell for the allocated time before leaving. The officials noticed. They marked his records as showing inconsistent performance in reward scenarios. This was not quite deficiency that warranted punishment, but it was noted gladiators who showed signs of weakness could be promoted to more dangerous matches where injury or death became more likely. The system had ways of eliminating pieces that no longer functioned optimally. So when Gas won his match on that September afternoon, earning the right to claim a Category 3 prisoner, he felt dread rather than anticipation. He knew what was expected. He knew that failing to perform would raise questions about his continued usefulness. He knew the woman waiting in the cell was someone's daughter or sister, that she had watched family members die hours earlier, that she understood exactly what was about to happen. And he knew he would enter that cell anyway because refusing meant consequences he could not afford. The system did not permit conscience. It permitted only function or failure. Livia knew nothing of Gas's internal struggle. From her perspective, chained to the wall in a cell designed for violation. He was simply the next horror in a series of horrors that had defined the past 6 weeks. She came from privilege that seemed impossible to believe existed only 2 months earlier. Her father's estate occupied a valley in the Carpathian foothills. They had Greek tutors, Roman trade contacts, sufficient wealth to live comfortably while maintaining independence from direct Roman control. She had been learning philosophy, music, the arts of an educated woman in a society that valued culture. That life ended when Roman troops arrived. The warning was minimal. Local villagers fled ahead of the legion, but elite families like hers could not simply abandon estates and infrastructure. They attempted negotiation. Livia's father sent messengers offering tribute and cooperation. The Roman commander ignored the offers. The orders were to take prisoners, not negotiate treaties. The assault lasted less than 2 hours. Professional soldiers overwhelmed whatever resistance local forces could organize. Livia's father was killed defending the main compound. Her mother was killed by a collapsing wall during the fire that consumed the residential buildings. Livia and her brothers were captured alive specifically because they were young and identifiable as nobility. The journey to Rome took 5 weeks. They traveled in cages on wagons, moving slowly through territories that Livia had never seen before. The conditions were deliberately dehumanizing. Minimal food, no privacy, constant reminders that they were property now, no longer people with rights or dignity. Her brothers tried to protect her during the journey. They positioned themselves between her and the guards when possible. They shared their food. They whispered reassurances that help would come or that they would find some way to escape. She knew they were lying, but appreciated the attempt. When they reached Rome and were processed for the triumph, the siblings were separated. Livia was taken to the Colosseum's underground chambers and told she was Category 3 prisoner. Her brothers were assigned to arena combat the following week. She would be permitted to watch. So she watched. She saw them dragged onto the sand, saw them given weapons they did not know how to use, saw professional killers cut them down while 50,000 Romans celebrated. The crowd loved it. The novelty of seeing noble barbarians realize their education and privilege meant nothing against Roman steel. The entertainment value of watching hope die along with the bodies. After the killing, guards brought Livia to the cell, explained she had been assigned, chained her to the wall, left her to wait for whoever had won the right to claim her. Now that person stood before her, tall, scarred, expressionless. She did not know his name, did not know his story, knew only that he represented everything that had destroyed her life. Roman conquest rendered personal. The system made flesh. She waited for the inevitable. What happened in those cells was not random violence. It was systematic psychological destruction designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Understanding how Rome institutionalized this requires examining the infrastructure and procedures that made exploitation routine rather than exceptional. The underground chambers beneath the Colosseum were called the hypogeum. This vast subterranean complex contained holding areas for animals, storage for equipment, mechanical systems for the elevators that brought prisoners and beasts to arena level, and specialized chambers for various administrative functions. Among these specialized chambers was a section that official records referred to as reward allocation spaces. Modern archaeological excavation has revealed approximately 20 small rooms along one corridor, each approximately 10 ft square, each containing specific architectural features that illuminate their purpose. Iron rings set into walls at heights calculated for restraining standing or kneeling humans, wooden benches positioned against walls, drainage channels with specific placements suggesting their function, doors that locked from the outside with no interior release mechanism. Ventilation shafts sized to prevent escape but provide air. The rooms were designed with careful attention to function. Most significantly, small niches were cut into the walls near the doors. Excavators found fragments of wax tablets in some of these niches. The tablets contained records, names of prisoners assigned to each room, names of gladiators who claimed them, dates and times of assignments, duration of access, notations about whether the prisoners remained suitable for reassignment or required disposal due to damage. The recordkeeping was meticulous. Everything was tracked. Everything was documented. The exploitation was not hidden crime but administered process that left paper trail because participants saw nothing shameful in what they were doing. This was reward system. This was policy. This was Rome functioning as designed. The procedures were codified in regulations that appear in legal texts from the period. A document called the Lex Victorium, preserved in compilations of Roman law, establishes the framework. Victorious gladiators earned rewards based on the quality of their performance. Spectacular victories earned better rewards. Multiple kills earned bonus consideration. Crowd-pleasing techniques earned premium selection. The rewards included monetary bonuses, better food and housing, reduction in required fight frequency, and access to Category 3 prisoners for specified durations. The law described this access using euphemistic language about utilization rights and temporary possession, but the meaning was clear to contemporary Romans. What made the system particularly effective as tool of psychological control was its public nature. The prisoners were not taken to private locations where abuse could be hidden. They were held beneath the arena where thousands of people gathered. The crowds knew these chambers existed. Guards discussed assignments openly. Gladiators boasted about their claims in taverns throughout Rome. The visibility was intentional. It ensured that captured populations understood the full extent of what defeat meant, not just death, not just slavery, but systematic humiliation that became entertainment for the masses. The knowledge spread throughout the territories Rome threatened. Resistance meant your sisters and daughters would be chained in cells beneath the Colosseum, while crowds cheered the men who claimed them. The psychological impact on the prisoners themselves was carefully calculated to break them in specific ways. They were kept alive and relatively uninjured before their assignments. This was not mercy. This was maintaining product quality. Damaged prisoners had less value for the purposes they served, but the waiting was torture of its own kind. Prisoners could hear what happened in adjacent cells through the stone walls. They could hear the footsteps approaching their own doors. They could anticipate what was coming with paralyzing clarity. The dread was as deliberate as the eventual reality. Some prisoners tried to resist when the moment came. The restraint systems were designed to overcome resistance without requiring extensive force that might injure the gladiator. The iron rings allowed positioning that made fighting back ineffective. The architectural features of the cells served every aspect of their function. Other prisoners dissociated psychologically, developing the coping mechanism of mental absence that humans have discovered throughout history when faced with inescapable trauma. They were present physically, but absent mentally, surviving by fragmenting their consciousness in ways that protected some essential core of self from complete destruction. The system operators understood this dissociation and considered it acceptable. The prisoners' mental states were irrelevant to the purposes they served. Only their physical presence mattered. Whether they experienced their exploitation as psychologically present or dissociated made no difference to Roman calculations. What did matter was the message sent to populations throughout the empire, that Roman power extended to every possible form of domination, that resistance led to consequences that transcended death, that conquest was not just political but personal, systematic, and total. This message was reinforced through multiple channels. Soldiers returning from frontier campaigns told stories about what happened to captured enemy nobility. Merchants who traveled to Rome brought back descriptions of the triumph celebrations. The information spread intentionally, serving as deterrent to future resistance. The system succeeded because it combined several forms of control simultaneously: physical control through architecture and restraints, legal control through codified regulations that made exploitation official policy, economic control through the reward structure that incentivized gladiatorial service, social control through the normalization that made crowds view this as acceptable entertainment, and psychological control through the systematic destruction of prisoners' sense of self and dignity. Rome had discovered that the most effective domination was not the kind that killed, but the kind that destroyed identity while leaving the victim alive to demonstrate the completeness of defeat. The prisoners who survived their assignments and were eventually sold into slavery carried psychological damage that marked them as permanently broken. They served as living advertisements for the futility of resisting Rome. This was the system Livby was caught in. This was the machinery that had processed thousands of women before her and would process thousands more. This was Rome's carefully buried secret, hidden not through concealment, but through normalization, so complete that contemporaries saw nothing remarkable about procedures that modern sensibilities recognize as institutional atrocity. The bureaucracy surrounding gladiatorial rewards was extensive and revealing. Administrative documents show how the system operated with the kind of attention to detail that Romans applied to military logistics and tax collection. A papyrus discovered in the 20th century excavations describes the reward allocation process. After each day's games, an official called the Perfectus Munerius, the director of games, reviewed performance records compiled by subordinate officials who tracked every combat. The records noted kills, techniques used, crowd response measured by volume of cheering, and any particularly dramatic moments that elevated entertainment value. Based on these assessments, victorious gladiators were assigned reward tiers. Tier 1 was standard monetary bonus. Tier 2 added improved rations and living conditions. Tier 3, reserved for spectacular performances, included selection rights from available Category 3 prisoners. The selection process itself was formalized. The gladiator could view available prisoners in a holding area and choose based on appearance and perceived status. Noble prisoners commanded premium selection because their degradation held more symbolic value. Younger prisoners were generally preferred, but not always. Some gladiators specifically requested older captives who they calculated would be more psychologically destroyed by the experience. Once selection was made, administrative officials recorded the transaction. Clerk filled out forms specifying prisoner name or number, gladiator name, date and time of assignment, duration of access, which was typically 4 hours, and any special conditions. One copy went to the gladiator school's records. Another went to arena administration. A third was filed with a category of documents tracking prisoner disposition. The prisoner was then taken to one of the allocation rooms. Guards changed her in position. The gladiator was admitted, and the door was locked from outside. A guard remained in the corridor to respond if the gladiator called for assistance or to notify officials if the allocated time expired. What happened during those 4 hours was theoretically private, but the thin walls and the documented existence of observation ports in some rooms suggest that privacy was not absolute. Some accounts suggest officials occasionally observed to ensure no damage occurred that would render the prisoner unsuitable for potential reassignment. The priority was maintaining usable inventory. After the allocated time, the guard unlocked the door. The gladiator departed. Officials entered to assess the prisoner's condition. If she remained physically viable, she would be cleaned and return to holding for potential reassignment to another gladiator after sufficient recovery time, usually several days. The cycle could continue multiple times before the prisoner was deemed too damaged for further use and was sold to low-grade brothel or simply disposed of. The economics were calculated carefully. Each prisoner represented initial investment in transportation and processing, maximizing the return on that investment required, keeping them functional for multiple assignments before final disposition. This meant gladiators were instructed to avoid permanent injury. Physical damage reduced value, but psychological damage was not only acceptable, but desired. Broken prisoners were easier to manage in subsequent assignments. They required less restraint. They showed less resistance. Their complete defeat was visible to new gladiators claiming them, demonstrating the effectiveness of the system and reinforcing the rewards of Roman service. The duration of 4 hours was specifically chosen based on experience. Too short and gladiators felt cheated. Too long and the risk of injury increased. 4 hours provided sufficient time while maintaining inventory quality. Everything was optimized for efficiency. The system generated substantial revenue through multiple channels. Wealthy Romans paid premium prices for seats at games featuring Category 3 prisoners because they knew the entertainment extended beyond the arena combat itself. The sexual exploitation was part of the spectacle even though it occurred underground. The knowledge that it was happening added another layer to the crowd's enjoyment of Roman power. Additionally, gladiator schools found they could attract better recruits by advertising the reward system. Men sold into gladiatorial service or volunteering out of desperation were more likely to fight aggressively if they believed victory brought access to women they would never otherwise encounter. The reward structure directly improved the quality of arena combat, which increased ticket revenue, which justified the expense of capturing and maintaining Category 3 prisoners. The cyclical economics made the system self-sustaining. Every component reinforced every other component. The result was institutional practice that operated across decades with remarkable consistency. Records show that the reward system began in some form during the late Republic, but reached its most systematic implementation under the Flavian emperors. Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian expanded the games dramatically as a way to legitimize their dynasty after the chaos of the year of 4 emperors. The increased scale required more prisoners, which drove more aggressive military campaigns, which produced more captives, which enabled more elaborate reward systems. By the time of Decian's reign in the 80s and 90s, the system was operating at peak efficiency. Thousands of prisoners passed through it annually. The procedures were so routine that officials could process assignments in minutes. The entire apparatus functioned with a mechanical precision that characterized the best and worst aspects of Roman administration. Before prisoners reached the allocation rooms, they underwent preparation procedures designed to serve both practical and psychological purposes. These procedures were documented in the administrative records that tracked everything about arena operations. New captives arriving from triumph processions were first registered. Officials recorded name if known, origin, estimated age, physical condition, and notable characteristics. Each prisoner received a number stamped onto a small leather tag that was attached to a collar they wore at all times during their period in Roman custody. Medical examination followed. A physician employed by the arena administration assessed each prisoner for diseases, injuries, or conditions that might affect their utility. Prisoners deemed too sick or injured were immediately sent to low-value disposal, typically sale to mines or agricultural labor gangs where life expectancy was measured in months. Those who passed medical screening were categorized. The classification into categories 1, 2, and 3 determined everything that followed. Category 3 prisoners underwent additional procedures specific to their designated purpose. They were taken to specialized bathing facilities where attendants scrubbed them thoroughly. The cleaning was not for the prisoner's benefit. It was preparation of merchandise. Romans valued cleanliness and expected even their captives to be presentable. The bathing was rough, efficient, impersonal. Attendants used stiff brushes and harsh soaps that left skin red and irritated. Hair was cut to uniform length, usually shoulder length for women, ostensibly for hygiene, but actually to remove one marker of individual identity. Uniform appearance made the prisoners interchangeable, emphasizing that they were inventory rather than individuals. They were dressed in simple shifts, white linen that was cheap to produce and easy to replace. The garments were identical for all Category 3 prisoners. The uniformity served control purposes. It eliminated status distinctions among the captives themselves. A noble woman wore the same shift as a commoner. Previous rank became invisible. After processing, Category 3 prisoners were taken to holding cells. These were larger communal spaces where up to 20 women might be confined together. The cells contained minimal furnishing, sleeping pallets on stone platforms, a single latrine in one corner, water provided in clay vessels twice daily, food delivered once per day, usually a GR of barley and vegetables that provided basic nutrition without any consideration for palatability. The communal holding served several purposes. It reduced the number of guards required. It created opportunities for prisoners to understand their situation through conversation with others who had been there longer. And it established a hierarchy among captives based on how many times they had been assigned, with newer prisoners viewing veterans with a mixture of dread and desperate hope that survival was possible. Guards maintained constant presence in corridors outside the holding cells. They could observe through barred openings in the doors. They ensured compliance with rules that were simple and absolute: silence after sunset, no physical contact among prisoners, complete obedience to any instruction from any Roman regardless of rank. Violations brought swift punishment: FGing for minor infractions, isolation in smaller, darker cells for repeated violations, reassignment to lower categories for serious defiance. The discipline was immediate and public, ensuring all prisoners witnessed the consequences of resistance. Some prisoners attempted escape during the early days of their captivity. The attempts were futile. The underground maze was designed to be impossible to navigate without guidance. Even if a prisoner somehow got past the guards in her immediate area, she would find herself lost in quarters that all looked identical, eventually stumbling into areas where other guards would recapture her. Failed escape attempts brought severe consequences. The standard punishment was public flogging in front of other Category 3 prisoners, followed by immediate assignment to multiple gladiators in succession without recovery time between. The brutal treatment that followed such defiance usually resulted in damage that rendered the prisoner suitable only for disposal. The message was clear: attempt escape and face something worse than what you are trying to avoid. Within days, most prisoners learned absolute compliance. They stopped looking guards in the eye. They moved only when instructed. They became quiet, passive, mechanically obedient. The transformation was visible. New arrivals retained some spark of defiance or hope. Veterans had eyes that were empty except for fear. This preparation phase typically lasted 1 to 2 weeks. During this time, prisoners existed in a state of anticipatory dread, knowing what was coming but not knowing when. They heard stories from other prisoners who had survived multiple assignments. They learned what to expect, and they had no choice except to wait. The psychological impact of this waiting period was as deliberate as the eventual assignments. By the time a prisoner was called for her first allocation, she had been thoroughly broken by anticipation. The waiting destroyed hope more effectively than immediate violence could have. It gave time for imagination to generate fears that exceeded reality in some ways while falling short in others. When officials finally came to select a prisoner for assignment, the woman chosen was already partially destroyed. The preparation had done its work. What followed was merely the physical completion of psychological processes that the waiting had initiated. On the morning of September 17th, before the afternoon matches that would end with gas claiming Libya, the arena hosted a special entertainment designed to showcase the Daean captives before they were distributed to various fates. This was called a spectacle of the conquered. The format varied, but typically involved forcing prisoners to participate in mock combats or humiliating displays that demonstrated their complete subjugation to Roman authority. The crowds loved these spectacles because they combined several forms of entertainment simultaneously: novelty of seeing nobility reduced to objects, vicarious participation and conquest, anticipation of the violence that would follow. 20 Daean prisoners were brought to arena level at mid-morning. 10 men, including Livia's brothers, 10 women, including Livia herself, all wore chains. Guards positioned them around the arena perimeter, while 50,000 spectators settled into their seats for the day's entertainment. The announcer, speaking through a bronze amplification device that projected his voice across the arena, described the captives. He identified them as enemies of Rome who had the privilege of dying or serving in the greatest city in the world instead of being forgotten in their barbarian lands. He emphasized their noble status back home, making their current state more humiliating through contrast. The crowd responded with laughter and jeering. Some spectators threw rotting vegetables. Others shouted insults in Latin that the prisoners mostly did not understand. The sound was overwhelming. 50,000 voices creating noise that drowned out individual thought. The male prisoners were given weapons, not the quality equipment that professional gladiators used. These were damaged, ill-balanced weapons that were difficult to wield effectively. The men were forced to fight each other while barely trained in how to use what they held. Livia's older brother, Debeles, named after the famous Daean king, received a short sword with a cracked handle. Her younger brother, Camacicus, got a spear with a bent point. They were placed in the arena center and told to fight. Neither wanted to kill his brother. Both knew that refusing meant immediate execution by the professional gladiators stationed around the arena perimeter. They circled each other slowly, hoping for some intervention that would not come, playing for time that would only prolong the horror. The crowd became impatient. Romans had paid for death. They wanted violence, not hesitation. Guards prodded the brothers with spears, driving them together. Finally, desperately, they fought. The combat was ugly. Neither had real training. They swung wildly. They stumbled. They both bled from minor cuts within the first minute. The crowd's mood shifted from impatience to amusement. This was entertainment of a different sort. Watching educated nobility flail incompetently with weapons reinforced Roman superiority more effectively than watching professionals fight cleanly. Livia watched from the perimeter, chained to a post that prevented her from looking away or closing her eyes. Guards had positioned her so she would have perfect view of her brothers destroying each other. This too was part of the spectacle. The crowd could watch her watching them. Her suffering became meta-entertainment. After 10 minutes, Debeles managed a lucky strike that opened a serious wound in Camacicus' shoulder. The younger brother fell. Guards called the match. Professional gladiators entered to finish what the brothers had started. They killed Camacicus with efficiency, then turned to Decius, who begged for mercy in broken Latin. The crowd voted with thumbs. 50,000 thumbs turned down. Deceased badly, taking 7 minutes to bleed out from a trident wound to the abdomen. Livia watched every second, screaming until guards stuffed cloth in her mouth to muffle the sound that interfered with crowd enjoyment. The female prisoners were brought to arena center. After the male executions concluded, the announcer described the next entertainment. The women would fight each other in pairs. Winners would be returned to holding with potential for eventual sale into slavery. Losers would be executed immediately. The choice was theirs. This was particularly cruel innovation. By forcing the women to choose between killing each other or being killed themselves, Rome transformed them into active participants in their own degradation. If they fought, they became complicit in the system. If they refused, they died. Either way, Rome won. The first pair of women was pushed forward. They were given daggers. One was perhaps 20 years old. The other was closer to 40. Both were dishand nobility, captured from different families, but united now in shared horror. The younger woman attacked immediately, not because she wanted to kill, but because she desperately wanted to live. The older woman defended herself. They struggled. Blood appeared. The crowd roared. After several minutes, the younger woman struck a fatal blow. The older woman collapsed. Guards dragged the body away while the younger woman stood covered in blood and trembling. 3 more pairs fought. Each match was uglier than the last. Each woman who survived was more visibly destroyed psychologically than physically. By the time officials brought out the 5th pair, the survivors stood in a line that looked more dead than alive, saved from execution, but ruined in every other way. The 5th pair included Livia and a woman named Andrada, approximately Livia's age, from another noble Dishaean family. The guards removed their chains and gave them daggers, pushed them toward each other, demanded they fight. Both women stood motionless. Raised her dagger. They looked at each other across 10 ft of bloody sand and understood that they were being forced to participate in their own destruction. They made a choice. They dropped their daggers. They sat down. They refused. The arena went silent. 50,000 people stopped cheering. The sudden absence of noise was more shocking than the volume had been. In that silence, two Dean women sat on bloody sand and refused to kill each other. The announcer was confused. This was not in the script. The spectacle was supposed to demonstrate that prisoners would do anything to survive, that Roman power could make even enemies destroy each other. Instead, these two were rejecting the premise entirely. Guards approached. They shouted commands in Latin. When the women did not respond, guards kicked them. Livia felt ribs crack. She made no sound. Beside her, Andrada was bleeding from a head wound. Neither woman moved to take up the daggers. The crowd's confusion turned to anger. They had paid for spectacle. They wanted blood and submission. These barbarian women were ruining the entertainment. Voices began shouting for immediate execution. Kill them both. Make an example. Show what happens when prisoners defy Rome. But here is what made this moment significant. The refusal was not just individual resistance. It was symbolic rejection of the entire system. By choosing death over participation, Livia and Andrada were demonstrating that Roman power was not absolute, that some choices remained even for those with nothing left to lose, that compliance could not be entirely forced if someone was willing to pay the ultimate price for refusal. The arena officials recognized this. They understood that allowing the women to simply be executed would validate their defiance. It would suggest that prisoners could opt out of the system by choosing death. It would undermine the demonstrations of power that the games were supposed to provide. A different solution was needed, one that re-established control while punishing the defiance in ways that removed its symbolic power. The Prus Muneries consulted with advisors. They reached a decision. Both women would be taken underground. They would not be executed immediately. Instead, they would be assigned to multiple gladiators over the following weeks with no recovery time between assignments. The punishment would break them far more thoroughly than quick execution, and their eventual deaths from accumulated damage would demonstrate that Rome would not be denied its entertainment, only delayed. Guards dragged both women from the arena floor. The crowd's anger subsided as the announcer explained the punishment. This was acceptable. The women would suffer more than if they had simply been killed. Roman power was reasserted. The spectacle could continue, but something had shifted. In that moment of silence, thousands of Romans had witnessed resistance that they were not supposed to see. Most dismissed it. Some were disturbed. A very few began questioning what they were celebrating. Among those few was Gaius Valerius Maximus, sitting in the gladiator section, watching the woman who would later be assigned to him being dragged underground to face systematic destruction as punishment for refusing to be entertainment. He had seen many things in 14 years. He had participated in horrors that he tried not to remember, but this moment clarified something that had been developing in his consciousness over recent years. The system was not just brutal, it was designed to destroy not just bodies but spirits. To eliminate every last possibility of human dignity, to turn resistance itself into fuel for further exploitation. When officials later told him he had earned premium reward for his afternoon victory and could select any available prisoner, he asked about the Daean woman who had refused to fight. The official smiled. She was available. She had already been assigned 3 times in the 6 hours since her defiance. She was damaged, but still functional. If he wanted her, he could have the satisfaction of contributing to her complete destruction. Gaius accepted the assignment, but for reasons the official could not have anticipated. The hypogeum was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that extended beneath the entire arena. Modern archaeological surveys have mapped approximately 2 acres of interconnected spaces. Though some sections remain inaccessible due to collapse or flooding, the complexity was intentional. It allowed smooth operation of all the different functions required to stage elaborate spectacles. One section contained animal cages. Lions, bears, bulls, exotic creatures from across the empire were housed in cells designed for their specific needs. Feeding systems, watering systems, ventilation. The animals represented substantial investment and required careful maintenance. Another section held mechanical systems. The elevators that raised animals and prisoners to arena level were sophisticated engineering achievements. Counterwares, pulleys, platforms that could be positioned precisely. The machinery required constant adjustment and repair by specialized workers who spent their entire lives beneath the arena. Storage areas contained equipment, weapons, armor, nets, props for elaborate staged hunts or mythological reenactments. Everything was catalogued. Everything had its place. The organization would impress modern warehouse managers. And then there were the allocation chambers, the 20 small rooms along the eastern corridor where Category 3 prisoners were held between assignments or during assignments. These rooms had no official name in surviving records. They were simply numbered Chamber 1 through Chamber 20. The bureaucratic designation concealed their purpose. Livia was brought to Chamber 17 after her defiance in the arena. She was chained to the wall in the standard position. Her ribs were broken from the guards' kicks. She had not eaten in 24 hours. She had already been assigned 3 times over the previous 6 hours, which was unusual. The normal procedure allowed days between assignments to maintain prisoner functionality, but punishment assignments follow different rules. She had dissociated during the previous 3 assignments. Some part of her consciousness had simply stopped being present in her body. She observed from a distance. She thought about her mother. She mentally recited poetry she had learned as a child. She went somewhere else while her body endured what it had to endure, but dissociation was not complete protection. Some part of her remained aware. Some part experienced everything, even while the conscious part fled. That part was accumulating trauma that would never heal. When the door opened and another gladiator entered, some fragment of Livia recognized that this would continue until she died. That the punishment for refusing to kill Andrada would be systematic destruction stretched across days or weeks. That the only escape was death, and even that would not come quickly. She did not look up, could not bear to see whoever had claimed her this time. She kept her eyes on the stone floor and waited. Guards stood inside the closed door and looked at the woman chained to the wall. She was young, she was broken, she was bleeding from injuries recent and less recent. She represented everything wrong with the system he had spent 14 years serving. He made a decision. Gas crossed the small cell and sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall opposite from where Livia was chained. He made no move toward her. He simply sat for several minutes. Neither spoke. Livia slowly realized that nothing was happening, no hands grabbing her, no commands to comply, just a man sitting against a wall looking at nothing in particular. Finally, she risked looking at him. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "I am not going to hurt you," he said in Latin. She did not respond. The words made no sense. She had learned over the past 6 weeks that Romans always hurt her. That was their nature. That was what they did. "I'm going to sit here for 4 hours until my allocated time expires," Gas continued. "Then I'm going to leave. I will tell them I used my reward. They will mark their records and you will have 4 hours without additional damage." Why, her voice was a whisper. The word came out in Dan before she remembered to speak Latin. "Because I am tired of being part of this," he replied. "Because I watched you refuse to fight this morning, and I understood that you are braver than I have been in 14 years. Because I can give you this one thing even though I cannot give you freedom or justice or any of the things that matter." Livia began crying. She had not cried during any of the previous 3 assignments. Tears would have been vulnerability she could not afford, but this unexpected not hurting broke something. The tears came and she could not stop them. Gas looked away, giving her privacy in her breakdown. They sat in silence while she cried. After perhaps 30 minutes, Livia spoke again. "The woman I refused to fight, Andrada, what happened to her? I do not know," Gas admitted. "She was assigned immediately after you were brought down here, probably to different chambers. I have no way to find out. She will die from this. Yes, you will probably both die from this. The punishment for not killing each other is being destroyed slowly. That is how Rome works. Defiance is punished with precision. Then what is the point? You not hurting me for 4 hours does not change what comes after, does not undo what came before, does not save me." No, Gas agreed. "It changes nothing except these 4 hours. That is all I can give you." They sat in silence again. Outside, the sounds of the arena continued. Distant roaring from crowds, mechanical clanking from elevators, footsteps of guards and corridors. The machine kept functioning around them. Livia studied Gas from across the cell. He was scarred extensively. His hands showed the wear of someone who had handled weapons for years. He was part of the system. He had probably claimed other women in chambers like this before. One moment of mercy did not erase his participation in everything else. "Why now?" she asked. "If you think this is wrong, why participate until today?" "Because I am a coward," Gaia said. "Because I have been surviving instead of living. Because I told myself I had no choices when I actually had one choice all along. I could refuse. I just was not brave enough until I saw you refuse this morning. I am not brave. I just could not kill another person to extend my own suffering. That is the definition of brave. Choosing principle over survival when principle is all you have left. My principle is getting me killed slowly. Yes, but you will die as yourself. I have been dying in pieces for 14 years, losing small parts of myself every time I made the easy choice instead of the right one. They talked. The conversation was halting, difficult, interrupted by long silences. But over those 4 hours, two people who existed on opposite sides of the system found brief connection in shared recognition that the system was wrong. Gas told Livia about his family, about the village in Gaul, about the tax dispute that led to enslavement, about the 14 years in the arena, about the slow erosion of everything he had been. Livia told him about Dosha, about her father's estate, about learning Greek philosophy, about the assault that destroyed everything, about watching her brothers die. Neither could save the other. Neither could change the fundamental reality of their situations. But for 4 hours, they were humans talking to humans instead of prisoner and captor, conquered and conqueror, victim and perpetrator. When the time expired, Gaia stood. I cannot come back. I cannot request you specifically again without raising questions. This was one time, I understand, I am sorry, I cannot do more. This was more than I expected from anyone ever again. Thank you. Gas knocked on the door. The guard opened it, he left. The door closed, the lock turned. Livia sat alone in the cell and felt the brief respite ending. Tomorrow she would face more assignments. The punishment would continue until she died. But for 4 hours she had been treated like a human being. She held on to that as darkness returned. Livia died 12 days later, not from violence, but from infection. The accumulated damage from multiple assignments without adequate recovery time between had created wounds that became infected. Without medical treatment, which was not provided to Category 3 prisoners, the infection spread. She developed fever, then delirium, then septic shock. She died alone in a holding cell. Officials noted her death in their records. Prisoner 417, Category 3 Dayan female, deceased due to complications from service. The body was disposed of in the mass grave outside Rome, where executed prisoners and dead animals from the arena were buried. There was no marker, no memorial, no acknowledgement of who she had been. Her death was documented only because record-keeping required knotting disposition of all registered prisoners. The papyrus marking her death is preserved in archives. Contains her number, the date, the cause written as fever following assignments, and a notation that the loss reduced available Category 3 inventory by 1 unit. She was inventory that had been depleted. The bureaucratic language concealed a human life destroyed by systematic exploitation. Andrada died 11 days later. Her cause of death was recorded as injuries sustained during multiple assignments. She lasted 1 day less than Livia. Her body went to the same mass grave. Other Dayan women from the same group survived longer. A few were eventually sold into slavery after officials determined they had been damaged too extensively for continued arena service. They disappeared into the vast slave economy of Rome, their fates unrecorded beyond the initial sale documents. Gas learned of Livia's death through the informal networks that existed among arena personnel. Gladiators, guards, and officials gossiped constantly. News spread quickly through the underground complex. He heard that the dean woman from Chamber 17 had died. He knew which prisoner that had been. He had expected it, had known that his 4 hours of not hurting could not prevent the systematic destruction that the punishment required, but expecting death and learning of it were different experiences. The confirmation brought a grief that surprised him with its intensity. He had known Livia for 4 hours. He had saved her nothing. His mercy had been microscopic and ineffective, and yet her death felt personal in ways that the hundreds of men he had killed in the arena somehow did not, perhaps because those deaths served the system. His arena killings were expected. They reinforced Roman power. They fulfilled his function, but the 4 hours with Livia had been resistance, however small, had been the choice to step outside the system for one brief moment. Her death felt like punishment for that choice. He began refusing reward assignments when officials offered him access to Category 3 prisoners after victories. He declined, said he preferred monetary bonuses. The officials noted this on his records with increasing concern. The third time he refused, they summoned him to a meeting with the Gladiator school administrator. The conversation was frank. Your performance in the arena remains acceptable, the administrator stated, but your refusal of standard rewards creates complications. Other gladiators notice. They wonder why you decline what they eagerly claim. Questions spread. The wrong questions can create problems we cannot tolerate. I fight well, I win, I make your school profitable. What does it matter how I choose my rewards? It matters because the system operates on consistency. When someone steps outside normal patterns, it destabilizes the machinery. We need you to either accept standard rewards or explain why you refuse them. I cannot explain in ways you would find acceptable. Then we have a problem. The problem was resolved through compromise that served both parties' interests. Gas would be assigned to more dangerous matches where his skills were tested against multiple opponents or particularly deadly fighters. These matches commanded premium ticket prices. If he survived, he earned increased monetary rewards instead of access to prisoners. If he died, he was no longer a destabilizing presence. Gas accepted the terms. The alternative was transfer to another school or reassignment to even worse conditions. At least this way he continued fighting without being forced to participate in the reward system he had come to hate. Over the following months, he fought in increasingly difficult matches. He survived through the same patient defensive style that had kept him alive for 14 years. But each match brought him closer to the statistical probability that eventually caught all gladiators. He knew his time was limited. He began talking to other gladiators about what he had learned. He was careful. Too much direct criticism of the system would lead to punishment, but subtle questions planted seeds. Why do we fight to earn rewards that make us complicit in atrocities? Are we not also prisoners, bought and forced into service? Does killing in the arena make us heroes or just tools of Roman cruelty? Not all gladiators listened. Many were invested in the system. They had survived by accepting their roles and extracting whatever small pleasures and privileges they could. Questioning the fundamental structure threatened the accommodations they had made. But some listened. Younger gladiators who had not yet become completely numb, men who retained fragments of conscience despite years of violence. They heard Gas and recognized truth in what he said. Nothing resembling organized resistance emerged. That would have been impossible. But individual gladiators began making small choices that echoed Gas's initial decision, declining certain rewards, showing mercy when possible, refusing to participate in the most theatrical cruelties. The ripples were minor, but they existed. The individual stories of Livia, Andrada, Gas, and others were not unique. Thousands of similar stories occurred during the decades when the reward system operated at peak efficiency. Most left no trace in historical records beyond administrative notations about prisoner disposals and gladiator performances. But occasionally something happened that drew wider attention. In the case of the Daean women, that something was a letter. A merchant named Marcus Tullus Fenius conducted business throughout the empire. He traveled to Dia regularly before the Roman conquest to purchase timber and mineral products. He had developed relationships with Dean nobility, including Livia's family. When he learned through his networks what had happened to the Dian captives, he was disturbed. Phineas was no humanitarian. He participated in slave trading as part of his normal business operations. He accepted Roman imperialism as natural and justified, but something about the systematic exploitation of women he had known personally crossed a line in his conscience that general acceptance of slavery had not. He wrote a letter to a senator he knew, a man named Stronicus Capio. The letter detailed what he had learned about the treatment of Dean women in the Colosseum. He framed his concerns not as moral objection, but as practical worry about how such treatment might affect future trade relationships with conquered territories. If Rome gained a reputation for systematic violation of noble captive women, would future enemies fight more desperately? Would it become harder to negotiate serenas? Stronicus Capio found the argument politically useful. He was positioning himself for influence in upcoming elections, championing some reform that appeared humanitarian while serving practical interests could enhance his reputation. He brought the issue to Senate attention. The debate that followed revealed the political calculations that governed Roman policy. The Senate discussion was not about morality. It was about efficiency, cost-benefit analysis, and political advantage. Those who defended the existing system argued it served important purposes. It provided cheap rewards for gladiators, reducing the monetary costs of maintaining fighting forces. It demonstrated Roman power thoroughly, discouraging future resistance. It generated revenue through increased attendance at games featuring such spectacles. The benefits were clear. Those who advocated reform made different practical arguments. The system created diplomatic complications. It made surrender less attractive for besieged enemies who would rather die fighting than see their women captured. It potentially reduced long-term profit from enslaved populations by damaging valuable captives. The costs deserved consideration. No one argued that the system was simply wrong. No one suggested that human dignity should prevent such exploitation, regardless of practical considerations. The entire debate occurred within framework that accepted the underlying premise that Roman power justified whatever served Roman interests. After several sessions, the Senate passed a law called the Lex Captiva Feminarum. The law imposed new regulations on the treatment of female prisoners. It required medical examination before assignments. It limited the number of assignments per prisoner. It mandated recovery periods. It specified that prisoners who develop serious injuries must be withdrawn from the reward system. The law was presented as humanitarian reform, demonstrating Roman civilization and mercy. In practice, it was inventory management. The regulations were designed to extend the useful life of Category 3 prisoners by preventing the kind of rapid destruction that Livia and Andrada had experienced. The goal was not to eliminate exploitation, but to make it more sustainable. Implementation was inconsistent. Arena officials had incentives to maximize prisoner utilization. Gladiators expected rewards that had become traditional. Guards implementing the regulations were the same men who had operated the previous system. The law changed paperwork more than reality, but it did have some effect. The most extreme punishment assignments became less common. Medical screening filtered out prisoners too damaged for further use. Recovery periods reduced the immediate death rate among Category 3 prisoners. The system became slightly less lethal while remaining fundamentally unchanged. This was typical of Roman reform. Adjustments to make exploitation more efficient without questioning whether exploitation should occur. The machinery was lubricated and maintained, but continued operating according to the same basic principles. Gaius Valerius Maximus survived 3 more years after his encounter with Livy. He earned his freedom through an unusual path during a match against 3 opponents simultaneously. He was severely injured. A sword pierced his thigh, cutting through the femoral artery. The blood loss should have killed him within minutes, but the arena physician, a Greek named Sodarides, was exceptionally skilled. He reached Gaius before complete exsanguination occurred. He applied emergency techniques that stopped the bleeding long enough to transport Gaius to the infirmary. There he performed surgery that saved the gladiator's life, but left him with a permanent limp that made him unsuitable for future combat. The owner of Gaius's gladiator school faced a choice: keep a crippled gladiator who could no longer fight, sell him to some other form of slavery where the limp mattered less, or grant freedom to a fighter who had generated enormous profits during 14 years of service. The owner chose freedom partly because Gaius had earned it through exceptional career, partly for public relations value. Announcing that the school granted freedom to a legendary fighter enhanced the school's reputation and helped attract new recruits who hoped to eventually earn similar reward. Gaius became a free man at age 35. He had no family, no trade skills except killing, no resources except the small savings he had accumulated through victory bonuses. He was free but purposeless. He spent the first months of freedom drinking heavily in taverns near the Colosseum. He tried to drown memories of the arena. He tried to forget 14 years of killing. He tried to erase the faces of men he had slain and prisoners he had failed to save. One night, drunk and depressed, he encountered a woman outside a tavern. She was perhaps 40 years old, marked by the kind of wear that came from hard life. She spoke with an accent that Gaius recognized as Dean. Her name was Camilla. She had been captured during the same campaign as Livia, processed through the same system, assigned as Category 3 prisoner, but she had survived. After 2 years in the arena reward system, she had been damaged enough that officials withdrew her from Category 3 and sold her to a brothel. She worked there for 3 more years before a client purchased her freedom as gift to his mistress, who needed a maid. Now she was free, but struggling to survive in a city that offered limited opportunities for former slaves with no connections or resources. She worked odd jobs. She slept in whatever cheap space she could find. She survived day by day. Gaius told her about Livia, about the 4 hours in Chamber 17, about the small mercy he had tried to provide. Camilla wept. She had known Livia in the holding cells before the arena spectacle, had talked with her, had tried to offer comfort, learning that someone had shown Livia kindness before her death mattered to Camilla in ways she could not fully articulate. They formed an unlikely partnership. Gas had some money. Camilla had survival skills honed by years of navigating Rome's underworld. Together, they managed to establish a small business, a tavern in one of Rome's poorer districts. The tavern became known as a place where former gladiators and freed slaves could gather without judgment. Gas hired staff from among those populations. He provided cheap food and drink. He created a space where people destroyed by the Roman system could find brief community. It was small rebellion, microscopic resistance. The tavern did not challenge Rome or reform the arena or save anyone from the machinery of exploitation, but it existed as a place where people who had survived could acknowledge their survival and support each other. Gas lived another 20 years, dying at age 55 from accumulated injuries and infections that his body could no longer fight. Camilla continued operating the tavern after his death. The business lasted another decade before new ownership changed its character. Nothing of their story survived except fragments: a property record showing Gas purchased the building, tax documents showing the business existed, a mention in one letter from a senator complaining about the low-class establishments proliferating in that district. No record captured the human dimension of what Gas and Camilla built or why it mattered. But it had mattered. For 20 years, people damaged by the system found a place where they were recognized as human. That was Gas's final act of resistance. Not dramatic, not heroic, just sustained creation of small space where kindness was possible. For almost 2,000 years, the chambers beneath the Colosseum were hidden. The hypogee was filled with dirt and rubble after the arena stopped being used in the 5th century. Vegetation grew over it. Buildings were constructed on top of sections. The entire underground complex disappeared from awareness, except as vague references in historical texts that most people assumed were exaggerated. Serious archaeological excavation did not begin until the 19th century. Initial efforts focused on uncovering the main structures and clearing the arena floor. The underground chambers were recognized, but their full extent and function were not immediately understood. Modern systematic excavation using advanced techniques began in the 1990s. Teams of archaeologists spent decades carefully clearing and documenting the hypogee. They mapped every corridor. They recorded every chamber. They analyzed every architectural feature. In 2018, excavators working in the eastern section discovered the allocation chambers, 20 small rooms along a corridor. Each contained the same basic features: iron rings and walls, drainage channels, evidence of doors that locked from outside. The architecture told its own story before any artifacts were analyzed. The excavators found remains in the drainage systems. Human waste that had been washed through channels over centuries of use. Bone fragments too small to be from the large animals kept elsewhere in the hypogum. Textile remnants that analysis showed were cheap linen of the type used for prisoner garments, metal fragments from chains and restraints. Most significantly, they found the record niches, the small carved spaces near doorways that had held wax tablets. While the wax itself had degraded long ago, impressions remained in some cases. Specialists using advanced imaging techniques recovered text from these impressions. The recovered texts were fragmentary, but revealing names, dates, notations about assignments, the bureaucratic language of inventory management. Everything confirmed what historical sources had described, but what many modern historians had dismissed as exaggeration. One particularly complete fragment read, Prisoner 312, Britannic female, age approximately 20, assigned to gladiator Titus Flavius, following victory, 3rd day of games, duration 4 hours. Condition following assignment requires 3-day recovery before next allocation. The clinical language, the careful tracking, the reference to recovery time that treated humans as reusable resources. Everything the text described matched the archaeological evidence. Additional excavation revealed scratch marks on walls and several chambers. Some of these marks were clearly attempts to track time, prisoners counting days through scratches in stone. Others were names or fragments of names, prisoners recording their existence in the only way available to them. One wall in chamber 12 had a name scratched multiple times: Livia. The name appeared 17 times, scratched over what appeared to be a period of days, based on the variation in the carving. Someone named Livia had been in that chamber multiple times. She had recorded her presence. She had insisted on her identity even as the system tried to erase it. Whether this was the Livia whose story opened this account is unknowable. The name was common. Hundreds of prisoners named Livia must have passed through the hypogam over decades of operation, but the possibility exists. And even if it was a different Livby, the scratches testify to the same human impulse to resist erasure. Archaeological evidence was published in academic journals. It confirmed that the reward system described in historical sources had been real, that the chambers existed, that the procedures operated as documented. The physical evidence matched the textual evidence with uncomfortable precision. Some archaeologists argued for making the chambers fully accessible to tourists visiting the Colosseum. Others contended the spaces were too disturbing and should remain closed except for continued research. As of 2025, the chambers are not included in standard Colosseum tour, though specialized archaeological tours sometimes provide limited access to scholars and serious researchers. The debate about accessibility continues. Should spaces built for systematic exploitation be displayed to modern visitors? Does showing them serve educational purposes, or does it risk titillation? How do you present evidence of historical atrocity without either sanitizing it or sensationalizing it? These questions have no easy answers, but the existence of the chambers is no longer disputed. The archaeological evidence is conclusive. What historical sources described actually occurred. The reward system was real. The exploitation was systematic. The machinery existed. The Roman arena system, particularly the reward structure that gave gladiators access to Category 3 prisoners, was not an aberration. It was the logical extension of values and assumptions that permeated Roman civilization. Rome celebrated power. Military conquest was the highest virtue. Domination of other peoples was framed as bringing civilization to barbarians. The exploitation of the defeated was not seen as moral failing, but as natural consequence of superior force. Within this framework, captured prisoners were not wronged innocents, but defeated enemies who existed at Roman mercy. What Rome chose to do with them was Roman prerogative. The concept of universal human rights did not exist in Roman thinking. Rights belonged to citizens. Non-citizens, particularly defeated enemies, had no inherent protections. The arena itself embodied these values. Public execution of criminals demonstrated state power. Gladiatorial combat showcased martial valor that Romans claimed defined their culture. Animal hunts displayed Roman dominion over nature. Every aspect reinforced the narrative of Roman superiority and Roman right to rule. The reward system emerged naturally from this ideological foundation. If defeated enemies belonged to Rome to dispose of as it wished, then using female prisoners as rewards for gladiators was simply efficient resource allocation. The prisoners served purposes that benefited Roman interests. Their suffering was irrelevant to calculations about proper policy. This kind of systematic cruelty requires specific conditions to flourish. It requires dehumanization of victims accomplished through categorization that transforms people into inventory. It requires bureaucratic administration that distributes responsibility so thoroughly that no individual must confront the full horror. It requires ideological justification that frames exploitation as natural or necessary. It requires economic incentives that make many people invested in system continuation, and it requires normalization that makes participants view themselves as following standard procedures rather than committing atrocities. Rome achieved all these conditions: the categorization of prisoners by type and number, the bureaucracy that tracked every assignment with careful paperwork, the ideology of conquest and domination, the economic benefits that flowed from the reward system, the normalization that made crowds view systematic exploitation as acceptable entertainment. The result was civilization that produced magnificent architecture, sophisticated law, advanced engineering, and stunning cultural achievements, while simultaneously operating institutional practices that treated humans as disposable resources to be exploited and discarded. This is the uncomfortable truth about Rome. The achievements and the atrocities were not contradictions, but were produced by the same values and systems. The administrative competence that built the Colosseum also administered the exploitation within it. The legal traditions that protected citizens also codified the procedures for destroying non-citizens. The engineering genius that created the hypogime also designed spaces optimized for systematic abuse. Rome was not uniquely evil among ancient civilizations. Similar practices existed in other cultures, but Rome was exceptionally efficient and systematic in its cruelty. Rome took exploitation and made it an administrative process. Rome transformed atrocity into policy that could be maintained across generations with consistent procedures and careful record-keeping. The psychological damage extended beyond immediate victims, the guards who administered the reward system, the officials who tracked the assignments, the crowds who attended games knowing what occurred underground. The gladiators who participated in the exploitation all were shaped by involvement in institutional cruelty that their society treated as normal. Some, like Gas, eventually recognized what they were part of and tried to step away, but most did not. Most simply performed their functions and collected their wages and accepted that this was how things worked. The normalization was so complete that participants felt no need to justify their actions because their society provided all necessary justification. This is what systematic oppression looks like. Not chaos, not the breakdown of civilization, but civilization functioning exactly as designed according to values that prioritize power over dignity, efficiency over ethics, and group interest over individual welfare. The lessons remain relevant because the underlying dynamics persist. Modern societies still create systems that exploit vulnerable populations. Modern institutions still operate through bureaucratic procedures that distribute responsibility. Modern ideologies still provide justifications for treating certain groups as less than fully human. Modern economic structures still create incentives for exploitation. The specific forms change, but the patterns repeat. Recognizing those patterns in historical contexts helps identify them in contemporary ones. Understanding how Rome constructed its machinery of exploitation provides framework for understanding how other societies construct theirs. We return now to that moment when Gas entered Chamber 17 and found Livia chained to the wall. The moment before he made his small choice, the moment when he could have followed standard procedure or could have deviated in ways that the system had not anticipated. He chose deviation. 4 hours of not hurting. 4 hours of conversation that recognized shared humanity despite existing on opposite sides of the exploitation system. 4 hours that changed nothing about the larger machinery but mattered to the two people in that cell. Livia died 12 days later. The mercy did not save her, did not prevent her punishment, did not meaningfully reduce her suffering. The system destroyed her as completely as it destroyed thousands of others. But the choice mattered not because it achieved practical results, but because it demonstrated that even within systems designed to eliminate every trace of human decency, individuals could still make choices that affirmed values the system tried to destroy. Gas paid for that choice. His refusal of subsequent rewards created complications that led to more dangerous matches. His questions to other gladiators planted seeds of doubt that the administration could not allow to spread indefinitely. He survived, but only by accepting increased risks that eventually crippled him. Was the choice worth the cost? The question has no objective answer. From practical standpoint, Gas achieved nothing except 4 hours of mercy that could not prevent inevitable destruction. From ethical standpoint, he demonstrated that collaboration with systematic cruelty was not absolutely mandatory even for those trapped within it. The scratches on the walls of Chamber 12 spell out a name 17 times. Someone insisted on being remembered. Someone refused to be erased completely. Someone maintained identity even as the system tried to reduce her to a number and a category. That someone was destroyed. The system won in practical terms, but the scratches remain. They testified to resistance that the system could not completely eliminate. They prove that even total domination cannot quite achieve total erasure. This is the legacy of the allocation chambers. Not heroic resistance that overthrew unjust systems, not escape narratives where virtue triumphed, but small, usually futile gestures of humanity maintained in circumstances designed to crush all humanity. Those gestures mattered to the people who made them. They might not have changed outcomes, but they changed the meaning of those outcomes. Difference between being destroyed while maintaining some fragment of self versus being destroyed after complete psychological surrender might seem minor to observers, but to the people living it, that difference was everything. The blood on the Colosseum sand was not just from gladiatorial combat. It was from systems of exploitation that ran beneath the spectacle. Systems that official records documented with bureaucratic precision while simultaneously concealing through euphemistic language. Systems that operated for decades while crowds cheered, unaware or uncaring about what their entertainment actually cost. Rome built the Colosseum to last forever. The structure remains standing 2,000 years later, a testament to Roman engineering genius. But Rome also built the hypogum, designed the allocation chambers, codified the reward system, administered the exploitation. The genius that created architectural marvel also created administrative horror. Both are Rome. Both are human capacity rendered institutional. The challenge is remembering both simultaneously, appreciating the achievements while acknowledging the costs, recognizing that civilization and barbarity are not opposites, but often partners. The women who died in those chambers deserved better than to be remembered as inventory numbers in administrative records. They were daughters, sisters, members of families and communities that Rome destroyed. They had names, identities, full human complexity that the system tried to erase. Most will never be known as individuals. Their names are lost except in a few fragmentary sources, but they existed, they suffered, they died, and their deaths served no purpose except to demonstrate Roman power and provide rewards for gladiators who were themselves enslaved to a system that treated humans as tools. Remember Chamber 17. Remember the 4 hours when one gladiator chose not to participate in what he was expected to do. Remember that the choice changed almost nothing, but revealed that choices remained possible even in circumstances designed to eliminate choice. Remember the scratches on Chamber 12's walls. Remember someone insisting 17 times that she had a name and an identity. Remember that the insistence was futile but meaningful. Remember that the Colosseum is beautiful and impressive and built on the suffering of thousands whose names and stories were systematically erased, but whose experience was absolutely real. This is not ancient history that has no relevance to modern life. This is human capacity for systematic cruelty when ideology, administration, and economic interest align. That capacity did not end with Rome. It persists in every era, taking different forms, operating through different institutions, justified by different ideologies, but built on the same fundamental dynamics. Recognizing those dynamics requires looking past the spectacle to the machinery beneath, requires questioning official narratives that sanitize cruelty into acceptable language, requires acknowledging that civilization's greatest achievements and its worst atrocities often emerge from the same sources. That is the lesson of the allocation chambers. Not a comfortable lesson, not a simple lesson, but one that matters if we want to understand how systematic exploitation operates and how it might be resisted even in small, usually inadequate ways by individuals who refuse to be entirely complicit in systems they cannot escape. If you found this examination valuable, if you believe these stories deserve honest telling rather than sanitized narratives that make ancient Rome seem less brutal than it was, hit subscribe. We will continue exploring the realities of historical systems that official records concealed or minimized. Drop a comment with your location. Understanding how far Roman methods spread requires knowing who else encountered similar systems and how different cultures implemented their own versions of institutional exploitation. The next video will explore another carefully buried aspect of ancient civilization, another system that functioned with administrative precision while destroying individuals, another chapter of history that demands honest examination. These voices from the allocation chambers were silenced in their own time. They left only fragmentary evidence, scratches on walls, notations in administrative records, bones and drainage systems. The evidence is minimal but real. They deserve to be remembered not as abstract victims, but as humans who endured specific horrors while maintaining whatever resistance was possible under impossible circumstances. Their strength did not save them, but it proved that even systems designed to eliminate all dignity could not quite achieve total victory. Remember Livia, remember Andrada, remember Camilla, remember the unnamed women whose identities are lost, but whose suffering was documented in bureaucratic records that treated them as inventory. Remember Guise, who made one small choice that mattered even though it changed almost nothing. Remember that the Colosseum's magnificence was built on systematic cruelty that Rome documented carefully while concealing through euphemistic language. Remember that the past was not simpler or more innocent, but was complex, brutal, and honest. Examination requires confronting uncomfortable truths rather than accepting comfortable myths. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more historical truth, and remember that the capacity for both extraordinary achievement and systematic atrocity exists in every human society, including our own.